A front page of the FT Weekend, U.S. national security strategy calls for cultivating resistance in Europe. A new U.S. national security strategy has called for cultivating resistance in Europe, warning that the continent is subverting democracy, blocking peace in Ukraine, and facing civilisational erasure from high migration and falling birth rates. Now, Donald Trump's first national security strategy since returning to office blames European officials for thwarting U.S. efforts to end the war in Ukraine and accuses governments of ignoring a large majority who want peace. The document also, which was released in the very early hours of Friday, which is a bit odd, I didn't have any notification, apparently, either, that it was going to come out. It underscores the radical reorientation of U.S. foreign policy under Trump and comes as the U.S. president demands to end the Ukraine war have sparked fears in European capitals of a pro-Russia bias. Now, apparently it diverged very, very markedly from President Joe Biden's national security strategy by cutting the emphasis on countering China and Russia and making the Western Hemisphere the priority in the core vital interests of the strategy. One individual, Tom Wright from the Brookings Institution, said this: the national security strategy is a blueprint for an illiberal international order. It abandons the core idea of Trump's first national security strategy and Biden's, that the US is in a great power competition with China and Russia. He went on to say this: it views China as almost entirely through an economic lens. It is silent on the Russian threat and spends most of its energy going after America's European allies. Now, the 33-page strategy said an expeditious cessation of hostilities is essential to stabilize European economies. That's on the war between Russia and Ukraine. But it goes on to say this: it also, and this is the interesting part here, highlights the ideological gulf that has opened up between Washington and its traditional allies, saying that economic decline in Europe is eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilisational erasure. Now, in a direct challenge to the EU, it says that the bloc's activities, and I quote this, undermine political liberty and sovereignty. It adds that Americans should be, and I quote again, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations, and lauds the growing influence of patriotic European parties. It's not a new thing, but I just want to ask you this, really. What's America's beef with Europe? And joining me to discuss this, I'm very, very grateful, is Sir Robin Niblett, former Director and Chief Executive of Chatham House, who is now one of its distinguished fellows. Robin, always good to see you, and thank you for making time for us at such short notice. You and I had a conversation, Robin, back in March when J.D. Vance made that address to the Munich Security Conference, and it was a stark wake-up call for Europe. That stark wake-up call has just got ever louder.
Yes, ever louder is one way of putting it. I think it is a return to the core view which was laid out at the Munich Security Conference, as you said, in February this year, which we've not heard so much of, to be frank, in the last few months, because we've been wrapped up in all sorts of other aspects of US foreign policy, trying to get a conclusion to the war in Ukraine, trying to sort out, the Gaza conflict, the Liberation Day tariffs. I mean, this has been one of the most hyperactive, in the negative sense of the word, I think, periods of American foreign policy I've seen in my career. Everything, everywhere, all at once. But frankly, despite the administration and the president's claims to have been fixing things, there's a lot of superficial fixing, but most of the conflicts and problems continue under the surface, and therefore they're back to the beginning of the record. It's like turning it over and starting again. But it does reflect. I'll just make this one point. I'm happy to take this where you want to. I think it does. What we're seeing in this language is the gut instinct of the president. It's the gut instinct of the vice president. It's the gut instinct of the most ideologically motivated members of the Trump administration, the kind of Stephen Miller crew, the Deputy National Security Advisor, the Deputy Chief of Staff to the President, who was very much at his side in the first Trump administration, an absolute loyalist who stuck with him, through the 4 years in the wilderness and has been given even more power in this particular administration. I don't think it reflects the view of all Republicans, clearly. And we've seen some very interesting pushback, actually, on the Trump administration's policies towards China, in particular, in this last week. So I'll just stop there. I think this is a statement. It's almost like scratching the itch that parts of the administration have not been able to scratch for the last 9 months, and put it out there. And they love it when the Europeans get upset and wave their arms and go, oh, my God, it's the end of the Atlantic Alliance. And Tom Wright, I'd say a close friend of mine, I agree with his analysis. But what this kind of stuff does is trigger off all of that. We need to go back to the strong Atlantic Alliance. And it then allows the Trump administration to say, what strong alliance? You folks are still only at 2.5% at that percentage of defense, of your GDP spend on defense. And there's some actually quite tart lines in there about Germany just creating new dependencies with China. And they happen to be right, by the way. So, I think this is a back to the old favorites song. I don't think it's going to have a lot of meaning to the Trump administration's immediate foreign policy, but there is an underlying threat there, which you picked up, Ali, in your opening remarks, about this sort of loathing of the EU, this loathing, in a way, of the established political parties, and wanting to use this as a rallying trumpet cry for what they call, the patriotic nationalist parties of Europe, to come up and team up with MAGA and do mega, make Europe great again. The actual title of this section in their report is Promoting European Greatness. That's the title under which all of the stuff you described came out.
It's really interesting you frame it this way, because there's a piece in The Economist out yesterday, the Economist newspaper, Robin. Trump world thinks Europe has betrayed the West. I mean, this is the language that's being used. And what it basically says here is that against a hands-off approach, prominent members of Trump world have strong views about how Europe should be governed. We've already talked about J.D. Vance back in February at Munich, of course. And there's questions about whether European controls on free speech and firewalls erected by mainstream parties have been erected against populist rivals. And people like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump don't like it, and they would like to see, I guess, the likes of the AFD, Jordan Bardella with the Rassemblement National, and Nigel Farage potentially here, get into office. Now, the big question is, if those people do get into office, number one, why is the US sticking its oar in? And number two, what does that mean for Europe? Because they could go down a Maloney-style route, which is, come back to a sort of more centrist norm, if you like, or they could go down a Viktor Orban route.
Yeah. Well, this is... Look, I said it at the time, and I'm going to say it again. I don't think any European country should be taking lessons on democracy from an administration that is populated by people who, to get into it, had to support the big lie that Trump won the 2020 election, which he most clearly did not, including 16 to 20 cases adjudicated, many by Trump-appointed judges, pointing out that all of the falsehoods said around the fixed election are falsehoods. And so when J.D. Vance, or this document, claims that Europe is becoming undemocratic and that it needs to go back to populist nationalism of the sort that Viktor Orban, as you rightly point out, supports, he has spent the last 10 years or so dismantling civil society, selling off or getting sold off a lot of the media organizations to large companies that rely on the government for big contracts, so that they just end up parroting the government line. This is not democracy. I mean, let's just be totally frank here. There's no point beating around the bush. This would be trying to take Europe and European countries into a line where each would be separate and reliant on America, each individually reliant on America. Now, there's no doubt that the European Union is full of inefficiency, underperformance. It's not completed even a single market since 1992. I mean, I could go through the list of complaints about the EU as well as anyone. But the fact of the matter is, small states gain sovereignty by banding together. So when a big state like America comes along and says, you're losing your sovereignty, you need to give up with the EU and discover your sovereignty again, it's because literally they don't understand what it's like to be a small state.
Do you think they're doing that, Robin?
State, you need a club.
But Robin, this is really interesting now. Now we're getting beneath the surface. Do you think that this is part of a plan on the part of certain people in the administration, led by the president, to see the disbandment of the EU in its present form? Because, to quote the president, the EU was set up to screw us on trade. I mean, do you think that's where this is going?
But, well, first point, that is the desire of the people who've mostly had the pen on this document. Again, I go back to saying America, even the Trump administration, is not one thing. Just watch the battles going on over their China policy right now, the battles going on over the trade policy. The people who've had the power of the pen mostly, you've got to read the whole document, there are some bits and pieces in there, are reflecting that kind of view. And again, if they could undertake, and I'm on the record on this, sort of regime change in key pivotal European countries, they would like to. They talk in the document. I've got to find a point here somewhere about supporting parties, that believe this. We need to make our effort, to really get involved with governments that are not subverting the democratic process. And by that, I'm not quite sure what they mean.
But this is extraordinary stuff, Robin. I mean, you could understand, look, a regime change has been tried in many countries. Normally, we're talking about Middle East here, or maybe we're talking about Latin America. We're not talking about allies in Europe traditionally. I mean, this is a real marked departure, isn't it, from anything I've seen for years?
It's a marked departure, but Ali, if you go back to where you started and some of the quotes you pulled out, and this gets to your core question you asked me a minute ago, why are they sticking their oar in? Ultimately, as they say here, they want a great Europe that is Western and European in what they believe to be the traditional sense. This is an administration that's most comfortable with the late 19th century America, maybe the 1920s, 30s. It's an America that should be dominantly white, that is dominantly Christian. And, you can have that view. It's a view shared by many people through Europe. You can have parties that may subscribe to that view. If they're democratically elected, they're democratically elected. The problem is that the parties that the Trump administration has allied themselves to that support that view tend to then say, unless you agree with us, you're not a true patriot. And if you're not a true patriot, you shouldn't be allowed to get back into power. So once we're in power, we're going to make it impossible for you to get back into power. And that's what worries me so deeply about this, is you can have that view, but ultimately they, a bit like the Trump administration in 2019-20, want to prevent anyone from coming in after them and having a different view.